let's have a great session. So let's start. So please.
Hi, thank you very much. I also hope everybody really enjoys this session, this presentation. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're watching from the world. I'm Nathan. I'm the presenter today for this session. Just to give you a wee bit of background about myself, I met saikat through both currently students at the University of Strathclyde. And why Mars? Well, I did this presentation a number of years ago as a collaboration with a group of colleagues, and I picked Mars as a subject specifically because I knew nothing about it. The idea was that we would all pick a subject and go from zero to hero in a month and do lots of research and try and become experts on Mars. So I'll leave you all to be the judges of that after the presentation. Now, bear with me one moment while I get started. Can everyone see that? Is that okay?
Yes, it's visible.
Yep. Okay, so Mars. Why Mars? Why the planet Mars? It's always been something that human beings have been fascinated by and interested in. It is one of the very few planets that is discernible with the naked eye. We can even discern the color. We've always known that it has a smoky red color, why it's partly named Mars. After the Roman god of war, and before that, the Greek god of war, Ares. It's also something that's always been treated and talked about in popular culture, particularly the last century or so, not always in the most dignified or realistic manner. We've always liked to speculate about life on Mars, aliens on Mars, and humans one day living on Mars as well. So it's not always very realistic, as you can see, big busty female alien empresses taking over the human world in these fairly ridiculous costumes. And there have also been some interesting speculations about it being a place of hostile life. This is possibly the greatest and most famous of them, H.G. Wells' novel War of the Worlds. And there's also an interesting backstory to this. This is Orson Welles, American director, actor, producer, who wrote and directed Citizen Kane, regarded as one of the greatest films ever. In 1938, he actually adapted and directed the novel The War of the Worlds for American radio and set it in New Jersey as opposed to rural England. But many of the people who tuned into this radio show back in the 30s, they didn't realize this was a fictional presentation. They didn't realize it was just a story. They thought it was a news report. They believed that America had actually been invaded by Martians and literally were running for the hills. They genuinely believed that Martians had arrived on Earth and were here to take us over. So people do take it seriously. People have always worried about Mars and speculated about Mars. It's always been part of the international cultural imagination. So, as I was saying, first of all, we've always been able to tell, even from Earth, that Mars has a faintly red, orangey tint since the time of the Greeks and Romans. We're now going to skip quite a way forwards in time to the early 70s, mid-70s. This is the first human object that's ever landed on Mars, the Viking landers 1 and 2. This is the first ever photograph of the Martian surface, equipped with scoops. You can see here digging through the soft Martian dust and soil on the top. But you can see here's this rocks and dust. Here's the other one. These two landers landed more than 4,500 miles apart. So engineers, scientists on Earth were hoping for something quite spectacular. We're hoping for us to see some really interesting, spectacular features. But as you can see from all these photographs over the years, these different locations as they moved around and maneuvered, not much really very interesting. It's just rocks, it's just sand, it's very flat. There's nothing really spectacular. As we say, nothing to write home about, nothing particularly interesting. But what we're going to do is we're going to take it back a bit. We're going to start with Mars' color. Everyone knows that Mars is red. Well, that's wrong. Mars is not actually red. Mars is in fact black. What we see, the orange, reddish, browny kind of dust, is actually what's called iron oxide in normal terms, in everyday speech. That's rust. The actual rock of Mars is black. And here you can see and some of this has been blown away by winds, been streaked apart by the climate of Mars. Now, centuries ago, even, there was an astronomer known as Ernst Öpik who speculated that life on Mars did exist. He thought these black streaks were life. He believed that they were plant life. In fact, they're not. They are displaced by phenomena such as this. In the distance, you can see a dust devil. That is like an on-land whirlpool, like a twister, a tornado of sand. But these things, because the Martian atmosphere is very thin, it's only about 1% the thickness of that of Earth. These things, sometimes they just splutter away into nothing and disappear forever. Sometimes they escalate. This is a fairly recent one. This is an image of it from above, which is about 12 miles high. It's very easy for the air to escalate and worsen into a storm like this. This is one of the Vikings observed from space. Now this can very quickly transform into one of these, and this can get even worse into one of these. And within a few days, just a couple of weeks sometimes, if it takes a whole month, the entire planet can be completely engulfed by one single storm. It can all start from one dust cloud, one dust devil, and encapsulate the entire planet. And these things are not an isolated occurrence. They happen fairly regularly on Mars. As you can see, hardly any of the surface visible at all. And for the vehicles or the robots that work on Mars, this is extremely bad news. For instance, the Opportunity rover. This is a simulation of its view from Mars based on data NASA received. The Opportunity rover was actually solar powered, so this was particularly bad news because during the storm, NASA engineers and all the technicians on Earth worried that it was going to be completely buried, that the solar panels would be completely wiped out, just flattened by dust and sand, and they wouldn't be able to use it again. Now, if you go back to the very early 70s, some of the first objects to go into orbit around Mars, Mariner 9, which changed our view of Mars, it arrived at the planet and found a very similar storm. This is before we knew anything really about the surface. Hardly any photographs have been sent back. But Mariner found that Mars was completely swallowed up by one enormous sandstorm. There were 2 Russian probes that were already there waiting for it. They were quite incautious. They decided, no, we're going to try and go all the way. They went into the sandstorm on Mars and were never heard from again. Mariner 9, however, floated around the planet for a couple of days, let the storm subside. And as you can already kind of see in this photograph, as the storm began to subside and die down and quieten down, you began to see little portions, little details of what the surface was like. You can already see a few mountains, which we'll look at later. But one of the most iconic things that I found, the thing that revolutionized what we thought the Martian surface looked like, was this: Olympus Mons, Mount Olympus, the largest mountain in the solar system. It's 3 times as high as Mount Everest, and it's overall, the whole diameter and the whole area covers roughly the size of France. So it is, by terrestrial terms, by Earth terms, it is absolutely colossal. The largest volcano and the largest mountain in the solar system. Here's just a close-up of what we call the caldera. This is where the lava spout of the volcano, millions of years ago, kind of spluttered to a halt and sealed over with its rock. As you can see, it's not a conventional mountain in the sense that they are on Earth in terms of ridges. This is like what's known as a shield volcano. So it's much more like a pancake than what we would usually see in mountain ranges on Earth. And as we just saw, its neighbors, also discovered by Mariner number 9. These are the fastest from north to south. There's Theus Mons, Pavonis Mons, and Arcia Mons, all of them having diameters at least 200 miles. But also in this photograph, you can see the westernmost end of another iconic feature of Mars, which Mariner 9 discovered, a canyon that is named after it. This is Valles Marineris. This is possibly the biggest and most extensive feature of the entire Martian surface. It's almost 3,000 miles long. At its deepest, it's more than 4 miles deep, and its widest, more than 370 miles across. That's long enough to wrap almost 1/5 of the way around the entire planet. We can see here some of the the data given back to us from various satellites, various expeditions, various levels of sophistication, various levels of detail. Good news is we're still studying it. Geologists are still looking for subterranean water, which we'll come back to later. We're still looking at all the ridges, all the gulches, all the mountains that are within this huge labyrinthine canyon system. But the most important thing that these orbiters as a whole contributed, the Mariners, the Vikings, was that they were able to provide us for the first time with a complete atlas of the surface of the planet Mars. You can see here, this is a mosaic of lots of images taken by the Viking orbiters over a number of weeks. You can see the Tharsis Mountains, you can see almost the North Pole, you can see the Valles Marineris as well. And here you can see what scientists were able to do with the photographs that they sent back. We were able to snip up the photos they sent back and create these huge globes of Mars, try and make as detailed and as comprehensive a picture of the Martian surface as we possibly could. Of course, technology, cameras, radars, all kinds of data is much more accurate now. We can send back many more photos than we could before. So by now, we know quite a lot about Mars. We know about the seasons. We know quite a lot about all the different regions of Mars. For instance, we know that Mars is more and more similar to Earth. We've known for quite a while that it has winters. Sometimes Mars actually has frost. There's actually quite a lot, as we'll see soon, there's quite a lot of water on Mars during the winter. It has frost, it has ice on the ground, just like it does here. It has a North Pole and a South Pole, just like we do on Earth. And just like on Earth, they expand during the winter and they contract and recede during the winter. Here is just another picture of the North Pole, but this is quite an important picture. This was released very, very recently. This is taken by the orbiter of the most recent player in the space race, China, the Taiwan Tianwen-1 orbiter. This is a wee selfie that it took as it was in orbit around Mars. As I'm sure we all know, space race was primarily between Russia and the United States of America during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But China has finally joined the space race and is determined to establish itself as a superpower in discovery and space exploration. As we'll see again, we'll see more about it a little bit later on. So here's the South Pole, like its neighbor in the north. In the winter, it blurs, it expands into the mountains. Sometimes I'll show you again a photograph that we just saw of Mars. This is comparing the before and after storm. Oh, how do I get rid of that? Good. Okay. So, but ignoring the storm in this case, you can see at the bottom how far the South Pole has expanded, how big it has become during the Martian winter. But there are many really, really interesting service. This partly feeds into human tendency to apply stories and apply familiar things to what we see in literally alien worlds. This is the giant footprint. This is two huge craters on the Martian surface, which over the course of millennia landed quite close together, smashed together. They're photographed by chance by the Mariner 7 just before the major Mariner arrival in 1971. And scientists and personnel in the media nicknamed this feature the giant footprint. But we're always discovering new and weird, wonderful aspects of Mars and features of its surface, always discovering new geological features of it. For instance, the Korolev crater, one of the best and most enlightening recent discoveries. This is an impact crater from an asteroid hundreds of millions of years ago, 50 miles wide. But fascinatingly for scientists, but it's particularly in the quest for life on Mars, this crater houses more than 500 cubic miles of frozen water. There is vast some of volume of water on Mars, which we'll look into a little bit more detail later on. The way this works is that the altitude of the top traps the Martian air, and which cools and prevents the water underneath it from melting. So it's a very unique case, the Korolev crater, that it's able to encase and contain so much water. And again, another one, these kind of massive impact basins and craters. This one is another one that's 50 miles wide, all over the Martian surface. It's always giving us new secrets, revealing new secrets. And very recently, we're kind of back in the boring kind of rocky desert. This is where Zhurong rover landed. It's not quite so interested in large spectacle. It's not quite so interested in finding mountains or examining big craters or going through canyons or anything like that. This Zhurong rover is equipped with only a handful of tiny tools to help it in its quest for evidence of microscopic prehistoric life. However, when we're talking about what Mars looks like and what are the features of Mars, what can we find on Mars, it's also worth talking about what cannot be found on Mars, what we think is there before, turns out it wasn't. This is an American gentleman called Percival Lowell, and he was a very interesting, very highly educated gentleman. He was a Harvard graduate, a very interesting life. He was the foreign secretary in Korea for a while. He wrote and studied books about Japanese culture, Japanese medicine, Japanese psychology, and Japanese language. We also know a very large number of books about Mars. In fact, he was a very wealthy businessman as well, and he was able to establish his very own observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. And while his findings, as we'll see, weren't always perfect, because he founded this observatory specifically where visibility was best. That had never been done before with observatories. That's now a common practice. So astronomy does owe Lowell quite a big debt in the system of finding the best, clearest skies to use at night for observing things. However, he was influenced by an Italian called Schiaparelli, who we'll get to in a second. So he discusses in one of his many books about Mars, the desert-like surface, the lack of water. So he's assuming that inhabitants of other worlds, as in Martians, aliens, they would have to irrigate life. They would have to channel their own water. They would have to pilot water around the planet. Well, this gentleman Schiaparelli, he's an Italian astronomer. He made lots of maps of Mars. You can see some of them here, a flattened version. You can see all the different regions. There's various canyons, there's river systems, all kinds of things like that, which looks, fairly plausible, fairly reasonable map, fairly, considering the technology of the time, the telescopes wouldn't have been quite sophisticated. However, Percival Lowell, as I said, he found the word canali in Schiaparelli's writing, which is Italian for channels, but he translated as a canal. So this is not a negligible difference. But a canal is an artificial waterway that is made by humans to channel water, either to make parts of the world more habitable or to use it for irrigation and grow crops. A channel, however, is a naturally occurring waterway. That's just a natural geological feature of the Earth, water running between two bodies of rock, creating rivers, for instance, the most famous one in the world, the English Channel. However, because Lowell interpreted this as channel, he believed that on Mars there was an alien civilization building channels, building rivers on Mars, and piloting water around to feed an ailing civilization. So from his observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, he believed that he could see huge networks of pipelines and tubes, all kinds of things traversing the Martian surface. And over the years, he sketched his findings out in exceeding detail, dozens upon dozens of maps charting what he believed was the flow of water, how this civilization was maneuvering vast volumes of water from the poles throughout the planet into what he thought were different cities, different ecosystems, different countries on Mars, different parts of the Martian world were in collaboration to help themselves subsist and avoid extinction. So these are all the maps that he designed, or many of them. And they were not only there on Mars, they weren't only a feature of Martian life, they were a symptom, a signal of a civilization that was far beyond the technological capacity of humans. As you can see, a mind of no mean order would seem to have presided over the system of canals that we see. Certainly, what we see hints at the existence of beings who are in advance of, not behind us in the journey of life. So we believe not only that, it's a fairly elaborate view, considering he was only looking at one telescope from Arizona. He deduced that not only was a civilization on Mars, not only was a civilization using canals to pilot water on the planet, but that it was far in advance of Earth, and that it was necessary for this in order for them to survive. However, there is a difficulty with Lowell, and we'll explain that in just a second. It's fairly simple to debunk all this stuff. The canali, as he called them, he's referring to Schiaparelli, showed straighter and narrower than they had in 1877. What the eye has seen once, it can always see better a second time. Well, unfortunately for Lowell, that's actually right. He was looking at Mars, he was observing Mars, making these maps, drawing these diagrams in the 1890s and the early 1900s, when technology was not very sophisticated and it was easy for humans to be tricked by shadows, geological features far away. But we've already seen quite a lot of what the surface of Mars looks like, and there are no canals. There are no big water systems. We could use a direct example. Here is Lowell's diagram of the North Pole, complete with all the irrigation systems, all the canals, all the waterways he believed that he saw. But here we have a photograph of the North Pole, and we can clearly see that there is nothing there. It's a great shame, it's a great idea, but unfortunately for both Schiaparelli and Lowell, they made all these maps, all these efforts based on tricks of the eye. It was simply the Martian geology from so far away was literally just casting shadows. And they're not the only ones to fall for this. There's another famous aspect of Mars. Anyone spot anything in the ground here? I'll point it out for you if you need. This is the face of Mars into the region of Cydonia. This is a very famous rock. This made it into the newspapers all over America. And of course, there were the inevitable Martians, conspiracy theorists, obviously assuming there was a fossil on Mars, or that there was a human face, or possibly there are some very elaborate versions where they deduced based on this one photograph that humans were Martians, had come from Mars. However, like Schiaparelli, just like Lowell, the photograph was just deceived by a trick of the light. This is what the rock actually looks like. It's a pity to spoil the fun for everyone and say that the rock isn't a Martian face after all. It was just a trick of the light. It was just an optical illusion. There is one little cartoon face, which is a little bit more difficult to argue with. You can see again the black streak where a small dust devil has scratched away some of the dust and the rock on the surface. There's quite a famous cartoon face on the surface of Mars in the Geller's crater. And it's actually been used in Watchmen. Anyone who's into their comics or superhero films will hopefully recognize this from Mars. This is the region where Dr. Manhattan escapes to Mars for the day to get, escape from the iniquities and the selfishness of human beings. But we come to our last. One of the big problems that always pestered humans is there life on Mars. We know from many, many films over the years, lots of TV shows, that Hollywood certainly thinks so. Hollywood certainly believes that there's life on Mars, and it has come up with lots of different, many of them quite sinister ideas about what this life would be like and what it would intend to do with life on Earth. But we're going to have to be slightly more realistic in our search for life on Mars. So what do we know about life? We know that life needs water. Well, does Mars have water? We know that it used to. There are thousands of pictures of the Martian surface showing genuine old canyons, waterways, vast stretches of land which have been cut and dug away and chipped away by running water, some places even seas in the past. So bodies of water which you would think potentially show life. And again, there's more discoveries all the time, different layers of rock being discovered, which showing, again, similar to what Earth is like, different geological phases of life of the Martian surface. So it was a huge project a number of years ago. So on top left, we have the very large telescope facility in Chile, the Keck 2 telescope and the NASA infrared telescope. They're both in Hawaii. Between the three of these facilities, they were able to photograph the entire Martian atmosphere, measuring water molecules that had been left in the Martian atmosphere as it slowly vanished into the cosmos. And they discovered that Mars used to be covered in a huge ocean, which would have covered roughly 1/5 of the planet, roughly the proportion that the Atlantic Ocean covers on Earth. They discovered that as Mars slowly lost its atmosphere over billions of years, water atoms, billions of them every second, escaped into space and vanished forever. As this happened, the larger ocean receded, it shrunk, it climbed slowly northwards up the planet until it shriveled into the tiny little part of the water that's left on the North Pole, where it's mostly carbon dioxide ice and water ice. But what has it left behind? Has it left behind any secrets? Are there any fossils? Are there any bones in the Martian soil? If there are, it would revolutionize how we think about Mars and the origin of life, both on Earth and elsewhere. These are the Viking landers again. We saw the wee scoops that they were using earlier. They were equipped with small ovens and equipment to test samples that they took from the soil without much success. Another attempt was made in the late 90s, Pathfinder. You can see right in the center here, this is the Sojourner. He's was about the size of a microwave. And this is him with the rock. He befriended Yogi. What Sojourner did was scraped away a couple grams of dust from the surface of the rock, brought them back into the main shuttle and analyzed them. Again, without too much success. Didn't find very much for life. Not a lot of good news so far for Mars. However, in the mid-noughties, it was discovered, or what we thought might be running water on Mars, running water on the surface of Mars. And later studies photographing similar regions in a bit more detail found that this is not an inconsiderable body of water. Some of these streaks are about 10 meters wide and hundreds of meters long. So this is not an inconsiderable body of water. What they felt was happening was in the summer, water was rising to the surface of Mars, breaking out in little pools on the surface and then cascading down during the summer and freezing up and being kind of almost fossilizing the surface throughout the winter. And that's why we see these streaks. So this gave fresh hope really to the quest for the search for life on Mars. But again, someone had to come along and spoil the fun. There's a paper published which suggested that because the Martian atmosphere is so thin, again, it's only 1% the thickness of ours on Earth, that Mars and the Martian water and the Martian rocks, everything on the surface has no protection from the type of UV radiation that we are protected from on Earth. So if there is flowing liquid on Mars, it will not be water. It will be, quote, a toxic cocktail of oxidants, iron oxides, percolates, and UV radiation. So not a very promising place for life to thrive. And that will be the same for all the rocks. Every day, the whole Martian surface will be baked in UV radiation from the sun. So for life, what does this mean? It doesn't rule out, but it probably means you look for life underground where it's shielded from the harsh radiation. Well, that's what we did. The good thing about science is that once you don't get the right answer, you don't give up. You keep looking, you keep digging. So we're back to the Valles Marineris. Again, it's been very recently discovered underneath the rock on the surface, way below bottom, just over a mile underground. There is a body of water roughly the size of the Netherlands. It's a very small northern European country. But again, not an inconsiderable body of water. So again, renewed speculation, renewed hope, possibly finding water on Mars and a body of water capable of sustaining life. And slightly before that, this is a digital illustration of the body of water discovered by the Marsis instrument. This found another much smaller body of water, roughly about, so far they know it's about 2 meters deep, underneath a big slab of ice near the South Pole. However, it's acknowledged that digging that far below the surface, although it might be a promising prospect of water, having a robot get to Mars and being able to unpack and assemble and then operate a drill that can drill more than 1 mile underground is far beyond the technological capacity that we have right now to show the disparity between what's possible and what we need to reach these bodies of water underground. This shows Curiosity, a heroic little device which drilled and dug in the search for samples of fossils and signs of microscopic life. It dug several inches underground and analysed the data it found there. And that was considered a tremendous breakthrough. So to go from digging only a couple of inches, or maybe at the most a foot underground, to digging more than a mile underground, it needs an almost implausible level of technology right now. And I suppose the only way to think about this is now is, even if we did find water, this is not a very pleasant environment for life. There's very little heat. Okay, there's no radiation, but there's very little heat. Wouldn't be much nutrition. There wouldn't be very much for any kind of life to thrive on. John Bridges from University of Leicester said, I think it's really stretching the envelope of potential life to the bursting point. However, we have to readjust sometimes and think, well, our own concept of life on our own planet is always changing. We're always actually discovering new species, for instance, but also new circumstances in which life can actually survive. For instance, in 2018, a number of papers were published after a 10-year project that involved more than 52 countries, about 1,200 scientists working on a huge global project studying an underground biosphere containing roughly 20 billion tons of microorganisms, which is hundreds of times the collective weight of the entire human population of Earth. And this biosphere comprises an area of roughly 2 billion cubic kilometers. So all of this is underground in microorganisms. Some of these creatures, if you can even call them that, are functioning at levels of, well, surviving at levels we didn't even think was plausible for creatures to live at. Some of them are barely functional. Some of them are existing on geological timescales. Humans, we always think of how do we perceive life, when we think of life, we always compare it to ourselves, how we age, and the mammals that we're familiar with. But these things are interesting that they exist on geological timescales. They exist. Some of them individual things existing for hundreds, thousands of years. And it's worth just reminding ourselves, how varied and how weird and wonderful life on Earth. A fairly healthy planet, fairly conducive to life and habitation. How weird it all can be. So this is a slime mold. I admit, when I came across this photograph, I had never seen a living creature that looked remotely like this. When I saw this picture, now this is an animal, believe it or not. Both of the features in that photo are the same animal. They're bodies of bacteria which harden into a stem to allow others to blow away in the wind whenever the whole community is threatened. These exist primarily in North America in the wild, but also, of course, in scientist laboratories all over the world. So how can we, pen life in when life exists that looks like this, fluorescent slime mold? How can we pen life in and restrict our perceptions of what life could be when we have invisible crustaceans with bright orange eyes and a transparent brain floating around in the bottom of the sea? So when we're trying to write off life on Mars, suggesting it couldn't survive, it's worth reminding ourselves what the variety of life actually is, and the perseverance, the stubbornness of life that exists in unbelievable, almost unimaginable places. So this is one of the scientists involved in the Biosphere project. So we must ask ourselves, if life on Earth can be this different from what experience has led us to expect, then what strangeness may await us as we probe for life on other worlds? And it's a good question, and we will only know if we go there and dig for ourselves and save the robots the bother. So we're inching forward all the time. This is one of my favorite photos of Mars, actually. This is very recent, the Ingenuity helicopter. So this is one of the latest robots that the NASA has deployed on Mars. It's accompanying a rover, the rover which will be analysing and scooping up all kinds of material and analysing them and conducting experiments in a stationary place. But Ingenuity will be flying for miles around to chart, basically to make a roadmap for it, to make navigating the Martian surface much easier. But the big breakthrough that Ingenuity, hasn't done much so far. The big breakthrough Ingenuity helicopter was known for was it flew 3 meters off the ground on the Martian surface. Humans can officially say we have had a successful helicopter flight on Mars. So it was a tremendous breakthrough. Again, just baby steps, 3 meters. You can't see very much from 3 meters above the surface, but it's an incremental step towards success. But as I mentioned earlier, China, the latest player, the latest big contender in the space race, is already kind of thinking way ahead of the game. They're already thinking about, well, putting humans side by side with the robots and the probes on Mars. So this is their simulation base in the Gobi Desert. This location was chosen apparently because it's, the most, or one of the most similar terrain that we can find on Mars that is related to that. One of the most directly compatible terrains on Earth. Apparently, Antarctica is actually more reliable, but let's face it, nobody's going to build a base on Antarctica. But what do we have in this facility? What is actually here? What do they do with all these buildings? What is going on? So this is almost, very, very futuristic, almost like space age, almost like a 2001 A Space Odyssey. All these costumes, they have facilities, they have, life, proper, fully functioning solar paneled little trucks and toys, mobile laboratories, sleeping facilities. They have kitchens, communal rooms. They even have an exercise recreation center. All have their own snug little beds. But for now, this is not an official training facility. It is a tourist attraction. But we can argue about the importance of the state and the nation in the space race. After all, the main prize in the Cold War wasn't the ordinary prize that we think of in war, the spoils of war. It was national pride. It was the pride of discovery, the pride of being the first people to do things. Well, China is very conscious of this. So they use this facility to take school kids and students, technology students, budding scientists, mineralogists, any potential students or people who are interested in navigation, exploration, the next generation of people who are going to be designing rockets, designing probes, designing all kinds of telescopes as well. So they do understand the value of cultivating a sense of not only interest, not only a sense of wonder in places like Mars, but the whole of the universe, but also cultivating a sense of, if you work hard and if you collaborate and you participate and you learn, you can contribute to that. You can contribute to that journey. You can contribute and you can make, if you work hard, you can collaborate on making these robots. You can collaborate on making these telescopes. So a nation needs people who look up at the stars. We hope the bases will let them feel the spirit of space exploration, not just the technology behind it. It's odd that this person is not a scientist. This is a corporate man. This is a suit. CEO of the Xinjiang Star Universe Culture and Tourism Corporation. So I'll just end here for now. This is China's next step. You may have heard, China has put its own rovers and probes on the moon, following America's wake. This was a moment of huge celebration in China. It was a massive national celebration, a huge event in China. discovered by U22. This is what has been called by the press as the moon shed, which is a tiny little square, a wee block in the distance. Obviously, very likely it's just a rock, but as humans tend to do, conspiracy theories already abound about what it might be. Maybe it's something left behind. Maybe it's something that's been built the last year. Who knows? But China know this is the next incremental step that China are going to take. The U2's next big step is trudging along the moon's surface, inching along one day at a time as it's piloted from Earth towards the shed to figure out what's the next step in this discovery. So, thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like, I'll take questions. Hey, go ahead, please. Yeah, get started. Well, as someone who is really enthusiastic about space exploration, I'd say definitely yes. I think the value of human knowledge is always worth it. Any enterprise, any project that expands human knowledge is worth the effort. It is worth the investment. It's worth the hardship. And it's also worth the disappointment. It's easy to talk about show all these magnificent photos and stuff, but let's not forget also there's over the years there's been hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds invested in missions that have crashed. But I think even they are worth. I see what you mean about could we not more productively or more successfully invest money in welfare things, for instance, or charities and stuff. However, if you apply that to every discovery that's made in any field, for instance, in evolution, in any type of scientific discovery or endeavor, or even previous centuries, exploration, different expeditions into the unknown, different discoveries, you could say any one of those was not worth it. You could have been giving that money to the poor. But those expeditions, those endeavors change the world, and they give us a more complete picture of reality. Those things do change life. So of course there is the moral consideration. Is it worth it? Are we ever going to find life on Mars? It's clearly just radioactive. There's clearly nothing there. The water's so deep. Why should we bother? I think we still should, because if we'd never bothered at all, I would never have done this presentation. We wouldn't know a single thing about Mars. If we'd never built any telescopes, if we'd never built any orbiters, if we'd never built any rockets, if we'd never even gone to the moon, we would still know exactly the same about these objects as we did hundreds of years ago. So yeah, I would suggest, I think for that reason that yeah, it is still valuable. It is definitely worth doing.
Hi Nathan, I would like to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, what's your perspective of life on Mars?
Well, I tried to keep that presentation quite discursive. I did try not to say what I think. I think there's 100% no life on the surface. That's what I think. There's definitely no life on the surface. If there is life on Mars, it is under under the surface. I think there's lots of weird kind of crustacean things and weird insects which live in caves and subterranean levels on Earth. So I think possibly there might, if it exists at all, it would have to be that subterranean life on Mars. It would have to probably be blind. We'd have to live probably in very unpleasant, quite cold, featureless, black, completely dark, totally black conditions. It would be probably quite parasitic life. I mean, I can't really think there'd be a very diverse ecosystem on a planet that is baked in radiation every day. So even the water on Mars is very often, you often read that it's water, but then someone comes along and spoils the fun and suggests that at that depth it must be full of salts, it must be full of poisons. So I think I do think life on Mars, sorry to ruin it, but I think it is actually quite slim. I think it's probably a very slim chance. But that's part of the fun, we won't know until we go there and dig for ourselves. I mean, for most of human history, we didn't know dinosaurs existed. We never knew that saber-toothed tigers, mammoths existed. So yeah, speculation I think is part of the fun. Oh yeah. Well, I think America will still be the heavyweight, barring a complete collapse of NASA. I think America will still be the heavyweight for quite a long time. There's so much prestige and so much history, and there's so much funding, and there's so many collaborations as well. It's not just, we often think of space race or space exploration as like a rivalry between the USA and the Soviet Union, or now Russia. It's not actually like that. There are lots of collaborations. Italy, for instance, the Italo-American project, they are the ones who discovered the underground water. So I think it will become more fruitful the more these countries collaborate. But I think China has a long way to go. It's good. It's good to remember that they are only where America was in the late 70s. They've only put their first rover on there now and their first orbiter there now. Whereas America have done, they've had objects and robots on Mars for so long. They've had so much information. Basically all our information about the surface of Mars come from either America or American collaborations with other countries. But I suppose it is also worth mentioning the United Arab Emirates. They are they're arguably slightly smaller players than America and China. But last year, they were one of 3 countries to put orbiters around Mars. In fact, they were the first ones of the year to do it. Their Hope orbiter, the ambition for that is to circle the planet every, I think it's 55 hours. And it's going to do that for a whole Martian year, photographing specifically the Martian atmosphere. So that's another perspective on Mars that we're still not, don't have as much detail about. It's tended to focus on the surface, or if it's talking about the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere in relation to the surface. For instance, the thin atmosphere. Well, what does that mean? It would have no protection from light. The United Arab Emirates project wants to get a proper, full, complete map of the seasons. But even then, we should mention that's a collaboration to some extent as well. It's the first Arab nation to have an orbiter around Mars, but it was launched from a Japanese facility. So even then, I think the collaboration is going to be key, because I think every country involved in the space race, or whatever we want to call it nowadays, probably not called that anymore, but they all probably realize that in order to get conclusive answers, for instance, digging, finding life, finding fossils, no one project is going to do it alone. We've seen that the technology right now allows us to dig a couple inches deep, or if it's a helicopter, fly about 3 meters above the surface. That isn't going to answer, doing things like that, unless you're exceedingly lucky, isn't really going to answer any questions. But I think if there was like a more, if lots of these countries worked in concert together, that would be far more fruitful. But in terms of who's going to be the main player, I think America is making exponential progress that China has a lot of catching up to do. It's fun to look at pictures of their little amusement park, you know, the simulation base where the students and the school kids visit. But that is too far from being a functioning simulation base for real astronauts. I think America, for the time being, is still going to be king of the hill, if you like. No, that's all my pleasure. Thank you very much, girls. I much appreciated, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope that was enlightening and entertaining for you.